Reframing Disability, a Chicana Perspective, created and narrated by Siena Coronado. Disclaimers. For the duration of this film, the term Hispanic is replaced with Latine, a more inclusive and slightly less oppressive term that represents the ties to Latin America that Latine people have and is also gender inclusive. I opted for Latine over Latinx because it is easier for Spanish speakers to pronounce. The term Chicana will also be used in reference to the framework I explored during this video. I use the feminine form Chicana because it recognizes the framework I use is rooted in Chicana feminism and queer studies. The film references can be found at the end of the video on the sources slides. For questions, concerns, or interest in further discussion of the content, please reach out to myself, Siena Coronado, at scoronado9@arizona.edu. I'd also like to say that I am doing this in one take. If I stumble over my words, I apologize. I do not know how to edit videos, so I cannot polish it, but I will do my best. Statistics of Latinas in the United States. The Latine population is the largest ethnic minority group in the United States today. As of 2021, the Latine population made up 18.9% of the total population. Now let's take a quick look at the amount of Latine adults that identify with disability. According to the CDC, 1 in 6 Latine adults identify with having a disability, and according to the U.S. Department of Education, 26.53% of Latine children between the ages 3 and 5 are identified as having disabilities, and 27.18% of Latine children and young adults between the ages of 6 and 21 are identified as having disabilities. Disability exists in all cultures, racial groups, and ethnic groups across the entire human race. The way in which cultures and groups of people choose to view disability may create the illusion that it is prevalent or doesn't exist in other places. Some cultures have disabilities and mental health problems that exist in their culture, but not other cultures. With that being said, let's do a brief overview of disability terminology so we can further explore how our perceptions of disability are shaped. There are 3 terms from disability studies that will be introduced today that will help us further understand a Chicana perspective of disability. Often when we think of disability, we think of visible disabilities. That being disabilities we can see. Wheelchair users are just one example of visible disabilities. Invisible disabilities exist too, but because they are not apparent physically, they often do not go unnoticed and forgotten. Some examples include learning disabilities, chronic illnesses, and mental health disorders. The next term is ableism. According to the Center for Disability Rights, ableism can be defined as a set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities, and often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or another. The last important term to be familiar with is disability models. How we view disability affects how we feel about disability. Models of disability refer to the different perspectives that people might hold regarding disability. Now that we have a basic background of disability terminology, let's look at disability models that pertain to Latine cultures in the United States. Tons of disability models exist, but there are 2 models of disability that I will discuss to help explain how the majority of Latines view disability. The first is the medical model. The medical model views disability as a deficiency or abnormality. Disability is seen as the result of a physical or psychological deficiency. With the medical perspective in mind, the problem is the individual with the disability. The one who can promote change is believed to be the medical expert. In the United States, the medical model of disability is a prominent, widely shared view of disability. Primarily, the educated population of Latines in the United States views disability in the context of the medical model, It's important to note that when we say educated populations of Latines, it likely refers to Latines who have been in the U.S. longer. For example, a study found that women of Puerto Rican descent reported fewer issues with language barriers and a lack of knowledge of how the U.S. medical system works compared to women from the Dominican Republic, Mexico, and other Latin American countries. The study concluded that this was due to the Puerto Rican women having been in the U.S. longer, thus causing them to be more familiar with American healthcare. It's important to remember that this model views the individual as the problem, and they have to be fixed by means of modern medical intervention. We will revisit how this is problematic within the disabled community and the identities of disabled individuals. Now let's talk about the second model of disability relevant to the perspectives of Latines and disability, the moral model. In the moral model, disability is seen as having meaning about the person's or the family's character, deeds, thoughts, and karma. From this perspective, disability can carry stigma, shame, and blame, particularly if the disability is seen as a mark of wrongdoing. Alternatively, disability can be seen as a sign of honor, faith, or strength. The moral model is popular all throughout the world, catering to the prominent religious beliefs of a cultural region. In post-colonial Mexico, Catholicism is the dominant religious belief. Indigenous beliefs and African folk practices exist alongside Catholicism in Mexico. It's important to recognize the mixing of religious beliefs. Gloria Anzaldúa explains in her book, Borderlands, La Frontera, that La Mestiza is a product of the transfer of the cultural and spiritual values of one group to another. Essentially, in Mexico, Catholic beliefs mixed with indigenous beliefs create this modern post-colonial mix of religious beliefs. An example of the two cultures mixing is seen in how disability is viewed in Mexico. Some say that disability can be caused by mal de ojo, the evil eye, and is treatable by a curandero, a healer. This is a perfect example of the moral model. Other examples lean more towards Catholicism, like the parents were given a blessing with a disabled child, and they were being cursed for their sins. Mental health issues can be seen as demon possessions or mal de ojo as well. In the U.S., Latina immigrants are less likely to report disabilities and mental health problems and seek medical treatment compared to Latinas who have been in the U.S. longer. It's important to recognize that the moral model of disability in the U.S. for Latinas looks different depending on which countries they originate from. Ultimately, though, the moral model views disability as either an honor or a curse from higher powers. This can be just as harmful as the medical model for Latina disabled communities and the Latina disabled identity. Now that we know about the two most prominent disability models among Latinas in the U.S., I want to propose a model of disability that transcends the dominant culture. I call it the Chicana model of disability. To create this model of disability, I used my knowledge of disability studies and personal experiences to apply Chicana spirituality and Gloria Anzaldúa's work to disability. I hope through this work I can create a new outlook for Latinas to perceive disability. I'm sure many of you have heard of Borderlands, La Frontera, but in case you haven't, this book was written by Gloria Anzaldúa, a famous scholar, queer Chicana feminist, and many other things. She is well known for her work on the mestiza consciousness. Something not many know about Anzaldúa is that she was disabled. But before we get into that, let's talk about the new mestiza consciousness. The new mestiza consciousness is the blending of cultures and the consciousness that results in the mixing of those cultures. The new mestiza copes by developing a tolerance for contradictions, a tolerance for ambiguity. We are going to explore how Anzaldua's teachings can reshape disabled identity for Latinas and create a paradigm shift in the current dominant post-colonial models of disability, a shift that moves towards the decolonization of disability and offers fluidity and identity as a whole, the encompassments of mind, body, and spirit. Let's circle back to Gloria Anzaldúa and her relation to disability. Gloria had a rare hormone imbalance that caused her to go through puberty at a young age and menstruate in infancy. She eventually had an emergency hysterectomy in adulthood. She also had type 1 diabetes, and complications with diabetes led to her early death at just 61 years old. Anzaldúa also dealt with chronic pain most of her life. There are writings from her where she explains her pain and things she went through with her conditions. Anzaldúa describes her experiences with being disabled as being a mutant stoned out of a herd, something deformed with evil inside. She said she learned early in life that something was fundamentally wrong with her. In Anzaldúa's tone towards how she views herself, we can hear the moral model of disability speaking. Her culture, parents, and community influence her childhood views of disability, and she internalizes that. The powerful part of Anzaldúa's teachings is how she used them to reconstruct her mindset and her identity. Before we move on, I would like to provide a disclaimer that although Anzaldúa recognizes that she experienced disabling conditions, she believed that the label disabled draws medicalized parameters around fluid bodies and chose not to identify with the label disabled. In this context, we can hear the medical model's influence on Anzaldúa's perception of disability in her older self. Anzaldúa is a great example of how Latinas change their perceptions of disability as they further assimilate into the U.S. and American healthcare system with each generation that lives in the U.S. Now we will explore Anzaldúa's teachings to understand a Chicana model of disability. Nepantla. Gloria Anzaldúa had many teachings about consciousness and how to come to terms with identity, especially for those of minority groups. Disability is a minority in the hierarchy of social norms. Nepantla was a concept Anzaldúa used to describe a state of consciousness that allowed for reality to be viewed in a more fluid way, a mind state that allowed for consciousness to expand and look beyond social norms. In-betweenness is the best way to describe Nepantla, existing in an in-between state. In Nepantla, you are exposed, open to other perspectives, more readily able to access knowledge derived from inner feelings, imaginative states, and outer events, and to see through them with a mindful, holistic awareness. Seeing through human acts, both individual and collective, allows you to examine the ways you construct knowledge, identity, and reality, and explore how some of yours and others' constructions violates other people's ways of knowing and living. In terms of disability, Nepantla can be used to embrace the disability one has, despite being deemed pathological or disabled by society. Essentially, Nepantla can allow for someone labeled disabled to step out of the restrictive term to better process emotions and thoughts regarding identity. This allows an individual to start discovering self-representation beyond internalized feelings of being less than. On a larger scale, beyond the self, Nepantla can aid in a paradigm shift towards new belief systems in a society that perceives identity in a new light and allows for better representation. Nepantla is a powerful way to move past and heal from negative self-perceptions caused by harmful narratives, two examples being the medical and moral models of disability that we talked about earlier. Before I move on to the next slide, I'd like to say that I'm going to start pronouncing Aztec god names, and some of these I may trip over, and I apologize in advance. the Kawatlikwe state. The next part of Anzaldua's consciousness is the Kawatlikwe state. Kawatlikwe is the Aztec Earth Mother. She is the serpent goddess. She depicts the contrary. For example, life and death, mobility and immobility, beauty and horror. She is a symbol of fusion of opposites. Demirjian, a scholar, states that as Anzaldúa associated it, the Coalicue state, with fear and the feeling of exposure or vulnerability. But as Anzaldúa acknowledged in her writings, there exists a cost for every increment of consciousness. And if the new knowledge gained by awareness is refused, then there is no moving forward on one's path. The Coatlicue state is where change is processed regarding ideologies, belief systems, perceptions of realities, and one's personhood. The Coatlicue state can help with processing a new model of disability and accepting it into one's life. How Nepantla and the Coatlicue state interact. First, you wake up with Nepantla. Then you enter the Coatlicue state. Then you heal on a deeper level and you move forward with a new consciousness. Using Nepantla and the Coatlicue state is how Latinas can learn and move into the light. Laura Mendina, a specialist in Chicana spirituality, makes sense of the process by saying in the Coatlicue state you learn from lessons that forces of creation and destruction offer. Remember, Coatlicue is the serpent goddess y la madre de la tierra. She represents the fusion of opposites. When you exit the Coatlicue state, you come out with a new understanding of your identity. This process is essential to the Chicana model of disability. You must understand how to challenge your current views of your identity, what model you and your loved ones see through regarding disability, to listen and understand the next part of this video. You have to practice Nepantla to enter the Coatlicue state, to then find meaning from the next part of the teachings. We're going to learn about Koiloshaki now. She is the image that has been on a couple of the slides already, but here she is again. I will connect her to the disabled identity and the Chicana model of disability. But first, here's a very brief backstory about her. Koiloshaki is the child of Coatlicue, who we just learned about. She is also the sister of the war and sun god Huitzilopochtli. Coiloshaki was killed by her brother because she attempted to usurp their mother, Coatlicue, of her powers. The story goes that he tears his sister apart and throws her limbs up in the sky. Coiloshaki then becomes the moon. The Aztecs have a stone of her where you can see all of her body parts thrown back together. The Coiloshaki stone can represent marginalized communities, especially those who identify as disabled. Coiloshaki is recognizable by the fragments of a body, not standing up on 2 feet, but rather her torso is floating above her legs. She provides an alternative way of viewing human wholeness, turning to the indigenous narrative, thinking beyond and without the norms instituted by colonial humanism. If we go back to Anzaldúa and her connection to disability, we know that Coiloshaki allowed Anzaldúa to accept fragments and fluidity as sacred forms of embodiment. Other disabled people can use Coiloshaki as representation of their own human wholeness and find fluidity in their disabled identity through the indigenous narrative of Coiloshaki. Koigo Shaki's story is rooted in violence. It is a classic narrative of a disobedient daughter being punished. But her story is provocative. It forces us to contemplate the violence that tears apart the disobedient daughter, and perhaps to imagine alternative possibilities for being and agency. Koiloshaki's story should make us reassess how dominant culture reacts to those who are non-conforming to societal norms. Koilosaki tried to rebel against the order of her society, and she was met with a violent punishment. As the scholar Suzanne Bost puts it, in order to represent those who are unrepresentable in the shared conventions of the dominant culture, one must first point out the violence committed by those normative conventions. Going back to the disability models we learned about at the beginning of the video, the medical model believes something is wrong with the individual but can be fixed by medicine, and the moral model either glorifies or demonizes the individual. We can see that these narratives do not give the disabled individual the space to define their own identity. Social norms are inflicted on disabled individuals from the moment they are labeled disabled. Though there are more models of disability that exist in the world, the dominant narratives among Latinas ignores the individual and tries to use exterior explanations to explain what is wrong with the person, rather than giving them the space to figure out their own identity and place in the world. I propose the Chicana model of disability as a way for Latinas to resist colonial narratives and reclaim space in the world. I hope that Latina disabled individuals can find personal healing through Chicana spirituality, and that the non-disabled Latinas can reflect on their current perceptions of disabled individuals and perhaps challenge their views. Ending the cycle of the dominant binary way of thinking, embracing a new mestiza consciousness in the Chicana model of disability can lead to a holistic approach to personal well-being and societal healing. This mindset can transcend disability, and I will end with a quote from Ansaldúa: a massive uprooting of dualistic thinking in the individual and the collective consciousness is the beginning of a long struggle, but one that could, in our best hopes, bring us to the end of rape, violence, and war. Reframing Disability, a Chicana Perspective. Created by Sienna Coronado. My contact info is scoronado9@arizona.edu, and I have also included a list of my academic information. If you'd like to review that, please pause the video. Here is the sources page. If you'd like more information about the sources, you can reach out to me, and I can provide you with direct links and PDF files to these. Just another page. And image sources. Most of these images were not copyrighted images and free through Canva, but some of them I got from the internet, so here's the links to those. And again, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns or would like to further discuss the topic. Thank you for your time.